So Gervonta Tank Davis versus Jake Paul seems to be official, and overall, as expected, the fan response to this fight has been negative. Gervonta Tank Davis has been one of the biggest and most controversial stars in boxing for the past 8 years, and in this video I'm going to go back into the past and explain in detail the reasons why people don't like Gervonta Tank Davis. First of all, I'm not going to cover Tank's cases outside the ring, mainly because this video is strictly about the boxing side of things, rather than his personality. Just to get this out of the way, I do think Gervonta Tank Davis is an exceptionally talented boxer. He's an unreal athlete with ridiculous power, fast twitch muscle, speed, reflexes. This video is not an attempt to poke holes in Tank Davis's skill set, but rather his matchmaking and attitude towards fights. When Tank began his career, he was under the wing of Floyd Mayweather. Around the age of 21 to 22, Tank was one of the sport's most exciting prospects. He was knocking people out left, right and centre, but never really fought someone of substance, until surprisingly he took a major step up in the form of Jose Pedraza. To this day, this is the biggest risk Tank has taken in his entire career. Tank was 22 at the time, and his opponents up to this point were very weak, so he'd never really had to deal with any adversity in a fight. Jose Pedraza, on the other hand, was a legitimate champion. He won the IBF Super Featherweight title versus Andrei Klimov, defended that title twice, and was 22-0 going into the fight versus Tank. It would turn out to be a breakout performance for Tank Davis, who would stop Pedraza inside 7 rounds, which immediately shot Tank into superstardom. People likes the idea of a young 22-year-old taking a fight like this, and not only winning, but winning in style in an entertaining fight. So Gervonta Davis was officially now a world champion, and the sights were now on his future. There were 3 other world champions in the 130-pound division at the time. Tank himself held the IBF title, the WBA title was held by Jezreel Corrales, the WBC was held by Miguel Berchelt, and finally the WBO was held by pound-for-pound star Vasily Lomachenko. These 3 guys were all people that Tank was in boxing fans' discussions to face. Lomachenko may be a step too far at this point, but Berchelt or Corrales were simple enough. Tank instead defends his title versus Liam Walsh. Walsh wasn't a bad opponent, but not someone who was in high demand at the time, and as a result Tank would knock out Walsh quite easily. Then Tank takes on Francisco Fonseca. Again, not a bad opponent, but not someone who's actually considered a dangerous fight for Tank at all. Now Tank would actually lose his IBF title on the scales in this fight, as he would miss weight, but the fight stayed on and he knocked out Fonseca. After Tank lost his belt on the scales, there was a weird situation that a lot of people seem to forget about. The WBA champion at the start of 2017 was Jezreel Corrales. Corrales was set to defend his title versus Alberto Machado. Machado would stop Corrales to become the new WBA Super Featherweight champion. So now for a brief time Machado was in the running to face Tank Davis as a champion. But the WBA really seemed to want Tank Davis as a champion. Tank's next opponent would be Jesus Cuellar. Considering Cuellar was coming off a loss, he was not a championship material opponent. But through sheer tomfoolery, what the WBA decided to do was to demote Alberto Machado from being the primary champion to the secondary champion, so they could make Tank versus Cuellar a vacant world title fight, even though Machado never really lost his world title. As expected, Tank would win and somehow become 2-time champion. Meanwhile, Tevin Farmer and Kenichi Ogawa fought for the vacant IBF title that was lost by Davis. Ogawa won the fight and became the new IBF champion. So now things had changed around slightly. Tank was now the WBA champion, Ogawa had the IBF, and Berchelt and Lomachenko still had their respective world titles. At this point there was now a discussion of who Tank Davis fights next. Obviously Lomachenko was the biggest fight, so he was the name people were talking about the most.
Which titles did you have your eyes on? Where do you want to go from here? Who is it that you feel like you need to take down next and put another strap around that waist?
I'm still young, I'm still learning. I'm still walking the path, you know. I'm just trying to stay focused and you know, get back to the drawing board with my team, Floyd Mayweather, my promotion, and my manager Al Heyman, and make the right decision in the sport.
It's a consistent thing with Tank where he never directly addresses a fellow champion in his division. Tank has never had any interest in taking charge of his own career, instead letting his managers pick and choose the right fights for him. Tank then took a surprisingly difficult fight versus Abner Mares, but Mares pulled out due to an injury, so that became Tank versus Hugo Ruiz. Ruiz was a C or D tier opponent, but Ruiz was a late replacement, so he gets a pass. Then Tank takes on Ricardo Nunes. Nunes was not particularly good, and not someone people wanted to see, and Tank would win the fight accordingly. At this point Tank seems to be done with the 130-pound division, and was now looking to fight in the lightweight division. What most people assumed was that this meant a super fight was going to happen between Lomachenko and Tank Davis. At the time, Lomachenko held 3 of the 4 belts. He'd conquered his 3rd weight division and was considered by many to be pound for pound number 1. The second champion at 135 at the time was Richard Comey. Not quite as interesting as Lomachenko, but still quite interesting. Instead, for his 135-pound debut, he takes on Yuriorkis Gamboa. Gamboa was a pound for pound name at one point about 10 years ago in featherweight. He was on a decent streak at the time, but he did get knocked out at the hands of a journeyman called Robinson Castellanos, and he'd actually not been a champion at all since 2011. Tank had some early adversity, but ultimately won the fight. He then immediately moves back down to 130 to face Elio Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz had just won the vacant title versus Miguel Flores. He was a solid, respectable opponent, but once again, Miguel Berchelt was seen as the strongest champion at the time, and Tank never made any attempt to face him. Tank would knock out Leo Santa Cruz in a now famous knockout, but that would be his last ever fight at 130, as he then made the strange decision to face Mario Barrios at 140, jumping up 2 weight divisions. While jumping up 2 weight divisions is impressive, he wasn't facing any of the champions at 140. Many people thought Barrios should have lost his recent fight versus Batir Akhmedov, but Barrios was a clearly bigger, undefeated fighter, so this was a strategic move to promote Tank Davis. That would ultimately pay off as Tank Davis won the fight. That would be the last time Tank ever sets foot at 140. Now, during Tank Davis's weight jumping shenanigans, Vasily Lomachenko has just been dethroned for the first time versus Teofimo Lopez. Simultaneously, Devin Haney had just become WBC world champion. So now there were 2 very interesting new fights for Tank Davis at 135 when he comes back. Tank's opponent of choice at that point instead was Rolly Romero. Romero pulled out of the fight, so the fight became Tank Davis versus Isaac Cruz. Cruz, in hindsight, is a solid opponent, but at the time no one really knew who Cruz was, and it was on short notice. It would turn out to be a very, very close fight, close enough that people were calling for a rematch, to which Tank Davis said, "I'm going to rebook" versus Rolly Romero instead. Again, context matters, and at the time, Rolly Romero was seen as someone who should have lost at the hands of Jackson Marinez. Tank got the win as expected, but by this point Tank was long overdue a super fight. And as it happens, around this time the fight was being floated between him and Ryan Garcia. Tank had to get a tune-up out of the way first versus Hector Luis Garcia, who was a 130-pound world champion at the time. Tank once again gets the win as expected, and the biggest fight of Tank's career was official. Despite the excitement about the matchup itself, there was some controversy, particularly in the rehydration clause, that had been placed on Ryan Garcia for the fight. According to Ryan, Tank would not take the fight unless the fight had a rehydration clause, and Tank himself would go on to explain why.
What's the thought behind it?
He's a bigger fighter. He's a bigger fighter, and he's only growing. Why would I fight somebody that's already? You see how he was coming from like 170, 180. Why would I try to? Not have a rehydration clause in there, so he could go back up to 150, 160 around the time we fight? No, I'm not dumb. People want you to be a dumbass. That's not being smart.
You prove that when fighters want to make a fight, you are the bosses. What do you want next after this fight? Give me your next 3 opponents that prove you're the best.
Ryan. That's the only thing I'm looking for.
So at this point, the problem with Gervonta Tank Davis is on full display. This sort of thing is exactly what separates Gervonta Davis from guys like Manny Pacquiao, guys like Canelo Alvarez, guys like even Floyd Mayweather. As much as Floyd gets a reputation for cherry-picking fights, he was fighting guys bigger than him on a regular basis. It is also telling that out of the 4 big names at lightweight at the time, Ryan Garcia, Lomachenko, Devin Haney and Teofimo Lopez, Tank decides to take on the least proven, least accomplished, least experienced, and at the time the least talented out of those names, and he's still the only one out of those 4 that Tank has actually fought. And not only that, Tank needed a rehydration clause to take the fight. As most people expected, Tank would ultimately win the fight. Around this time, Devin Haney had just beaten Vasily Lomachenko by controversial decision, and was officially vacating all 4 of his belts to move up to 140. Since all the belts were now vacant, it was around this time that Tank inexplicably was given a random title. There was no vacant title fight, no announcement, no anything. He just became champion out of nowhere. And that's the second time this has happened in Tank's career. Tank's first defense would then be versus undefeated contender Frank Martin. Martin was a talented guy, but someone who was coming off a shaky close fight versus Artem Harutyunyan. So naturally the expected result was Tank Davis to win by knockout, which did happen. Around this time Lomachenko would retire, following his win over George Kambosos. So with Lomachenko retired, Haney at 140 and Teofimo at 140, With the exception of Ryan Garcia, the top guys at 135 never got the chance to face Tank Davis. The next best thing at 135, however, was Shakur Stevenson, who just won a vacant title versus Edwin de los Santos. Tank's next fight, however, would be versus Lamont Roach. Roach was a 130-pound world champion, but that came by close decision versus Hector Luis Garcia, so no one really gave him a shot versus Tank, until the fight turned out to be extremely competitive, saw Tank take a knee, and in the eyes of most people, they thought Roach was robbed, as the fight would ultimately go to a draw. Naturally, after a controversial fight like that, an immediate rematch is in order, but the more time passed after the first fight, the more doubt seems to set in for the rematch happening, as Tank remained surprisingly silent in negotiations. And we just found out today the reason why. Gervonta Tank Davis is set to face Jake Paul in November, in an exhibition bout. Probably the most ludicrous thing Tank Davis has ever done in his entire career, and I just want to get my opinions on the fight out there. I'm normally completely fine and actually enjoy these circus fights. I've actually been entertained by Jake Paul's career so far. When he's fighting retired UFC fighters, 56-year-old men, Tommy Fury, they're entertaining gimmick fights is what they are. But I think there's a big difference between what Jake Paul did versus Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. and what he's doing now versus Tank Davis. Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. is completely separate from the championship rankings. He was nowhere near a world title when Jake fought him, and he'd already had plenty of exhibition bouts himself. Gervonta Tank Davis is not only a current world champion, but also a current world champion in a completely different weight class. Now, I understand that Tank being so much smaller makes the fight more intriguing in terms of its competitiveness, but in the process, this is robbing Lamont Roach of his opportunity to the rematch, and also holding up the lightweight division in the process. If you're going to disappear from professional competition to take a fight like this, Tank should be stripped of his title and let Lamont Roach fight for it. And if Tank wants to come back afterwards, he's got to be the challenger. As boxing fans, we've been waiting for Tank Davis to take a real meaningful 50-50 fight for the past 8 years now, and this is the closest we have. Anyway, in terms of how I actually see the fight playing out, as big as the skill gap is, I do see Jake Paul winning rounds early. Tank is very, very cautious early on, and he will be wary of the power of Jake Paul because he is a lot bigger. Tank will do his thing, circling the outside, landing body shots, until eventually Jake is a lot more exhausted, starts dropping his hands a lot more, and Tank may eventually open up as a result. It's a lot more competitive than the Anthony Joshua fight, but still a circus fight. Even worse in my opinion because Tank Davis is an active world champion. I actually favour Tank to win a decision in this fight. And anyway, that is my issue with Tank Davis and the fight, and that's going to do it for the video. Like and subscribe, leave a comment. Goodbye.